Have you ever wondered how your life would look if you were born into another family?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? My mother raised two daughters, and from the time we were little, she made it perfectly clear who her sunshine was. Joy could have shown up late, half-prepared, or even completely unprepared, and my mother would still clap like she was watching the second coming of Mozart. I, on the other hand, could have brought home straight A's, nailed every project at work, or quietly handled the bills no one else wanted to deal with, and she would glance at me like I had checked a box, nothing more. I learned to live with that imbalance, but I never stopped noticing it. What I did not realize until recently was that this favoritism was not just emotional. It had crossed into money, into paperwork, into something that could have destroyed her if I had not paid attention. For context, I work in medical billing. It is not glamorous, but it teaches you to spot patterns. When a number looks round, when a reimbursement does not match the type of claim, when invoices recycle the same words over and over, I notice. That is what happened when I helped Mom sort her mail one afternoon. A stack of insurance paperwork had piled up on her counter, and I offered to check what was pending, what had been paid, and what still needed follow-up. She waved me off, saying Joy had been taking care of things. But out of habit, I flipped through the stack anyway, and there it was, three identical care coordination payments, each exactly $500, each routed not to a provider, but to a consulting LLC I had never heard of before. The name on the line made my stomach tighten: Joy Carter Consulting. Now, sometimes caregivers do get reimbursed if they provide certified services, but it requires documentation, notes, and often approval. These payments were different. No service notes, no time logs, just vague invoices with words like support services and coordination. To most people, it would look like boring medical paperwork. To me, it looked like money being siphoned out of Mom's account under the cover of legitimate reimbursements. It was not just 1 month either. When I pulled a few more envelopes, I found the same pattern across several weeks. Round numbers, duplicate descriptions, and checks going to Joy's LLC instead of the actual providers. I had a choice in that moment. Pretend I did not see it and let my mother's favorite keep handling things, or take the risk of being accused of stirring up drama. I decided silence was no longer an option. The next morning, I printed the invoices and walked into the bank where my mother had her account. I asked for Mr. Alvarez, one of the fraud investigators I knew from previous cases. I told him, if this were your mother's account, would this look normal to you? He barely glanced at the papers before shaking his head. Not a chance, he said. This is either sloppy record-keeping or something more serious. He opened a preliminary fraud alert, froze the sub-account tied to reimbursements, and told me the bank would need an official statement to continue the investigation. He promised it would stay quiet for now, but the freeze was immediate. That meant Joy's next little invoice was going to bounce. Walking out of that bank, I felt a mix of adrenaline and dread. I knew I was setting off a chain of events that would not be quiet, and once my mother realized what I had done, she would probably take Joy's side before even asking me for details. That has always been her pattern: defend the golden child, question the one who points out the cracks. But I also knew the paperwork was undeniable. If this escalated, it would not be about me versus Joy. It would be about numbers, records, and signatures. That night, while I was eating a late dinner and trying to convince myself I had not just detonated my family, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find a small envelope with the words "Certified Mail" stamped across the front. The sender line read, "Carter Consulting." My heart thudded. Inside was a letter demanding full reimbursement for care coordination services rendered, threatening small claims action if payment was not received. It was addressed not to Mom, but to me personally. The kicker? The return address was not even in our town. It was a P.O. box in another county, set up under Joy's business name. She had escalated before I even had the chance to breathe. I sat at my kitchen table with that letter in front of me and realized the game had already shifted. This was not just favoritism anymore. It was fraud territory, legal territory, and I had stepped directly into the center of it. But instead of feeling fear, I felt clarity. If Joy wanted to play this game, I had more than feelings and suspicions. I had records, timelines, and the patience to follow every document to its end. That was the night I understood that my mother's birthday dinner, coming up in a few days, was not just going to be another family gathering with speeches and cake. It was going to be the stage where everything I had discovered would finally be forced out into the open, whether my mother wanted to see it or not. That night, a certified letter with Joy's LLC on the header hit my doorstep, and the return address was not our town. Walking into the birthday dinner that Joy had so carefully staged with the same confidence she used to select centerpieces and hashtags, I could feel the old choreography trying to pull me back into the role I had played for years, the quiet daughter who smiles, refills water, and lets the room orbit around the star everyone agrees not to question. Yet as I crossed the threshold and saw Pastor Glenn shaking my mother's hand and two of her friends from the senior center taking photos like a newsletter was already in layout, I reminded myself that I had not come here to play along. I had come here to set the floor back under my mother's feet, even if she hated me for it in the moment. Joy clocked my arrival with that practiced warmth that could double as a warning, and after a quick air kiss, she whispered that she had everything handled, which was her favorite word when she wanted me to stand down, and I said that I believed her, while the certified letter sat like a small weight in my purse, ready to change the temperature of the room by a few measured degrees. The first course came and went with the usual chatter about the senior center fundraiser and a neighbor's renovation that apparently required a petition, and I sat there answering politely while taking in little fragments that mattered more than the menu. Like the way Ethan watched Joy for cues before opening his mouth, the way my mother tried to pull Pastor Glenn into every story that made Joy look like a caregiver and me like a visitor, and the way the server quietly told Joy that the special cake she had requested would be sliced after the toast, as if the sequence of events had been rehearsed, which it probably had, because Joy liked narratives where she was the resolution and I was the footnote. When the glasses were topped off and Pastor Glenn lifted his in a gentle blessing that avoided taking sides, Joy rose with the kind of smile that says the ending is already written, and she clinked her spoon against the rim until the conversations thinned into a tension. Then she leaned forward and said a line she must have practiced in the mirror, a line that landed with the soft cruelty of a backhanded compliment, a toast to my favorite, the one who brought me joy, and the table laughed because the pun was always the point. And my mother laughed hardest because she loves a script where the audience knows when to clap. I stood before the last syllable had finished humming in the glass, not to steal the stage, but to return something that was already in motion, and with my free hand I slid the certified letter across the linen toward my mother, not with drama, not with a flourish, but with the calm of a person placing a receipt after a long bill had been inflated, and I said quietly enough that only our end of the table would hear, "Funny, because this arrived for your Joy last night." Then I stepped back and let the paper do its work. My mother blinked as if I had handed her a joke she did not understand, her fingers hovering over the envelope like it might smear, and she glanced at Joy as if translations were her specialty, which in our family they always had been, while Joy tilted her head at Ethan with a smile that did not reach her eyes and told my mother she would handle it later, which would have been the end of it if the letter had been a bluff, but it was not, and I was done with stories. That closed on command. Because I work with documents and not with declarations, I kept my voice even as I suggested she read the second paragraph, the one that referenced transfers flagged by the bank as possible misuse of a vulnerable adult's funds. And the moment my mother's lips shaped the word flagged, Pastor Glenn set his glass down with a soft click that sounded like a bell in an empty hallway, and one of my mother's friends leaned forward the way women do when they realize the conversation they were not supposed to hear is the only one that matters. Ethan tried to paste a reasonable smile over the table and said misunderstandings happen all the time with insurance and that consultants are common, which might have worked on a room that could be distracted by charm. But not on a pastor who has signed enough checks for the food pantry to know what an invoice should look like, and definitely not on me, because I had already filed the preliminary report with Mr. Alvarez, and I knew, with the kind of certainty you get after years of reading claims line by line, that the next swipe from Joy's reimbursement subaccount would be met with a polite electronic wall. The server arrived with the cake at exactly the moment when small talk would usually save the night, and Joy, eager to reset the tone, handed over her card with a sunny little quip about birthdays being priceless, and the server smiled, nodded, and returned a breath later with the expression every brand manager dreads, the one that says something behind the counter said no, and as the room tried to pretend nothing had happened, because pretending is a social skill we all practice, the manager leaned in and, very discreetly, explained that the card tied to the event deposit had declined and asked whether another form of payment would be convenient. So I reached for my wallet, not to grandstand, but to keep the staff out of a family mess they did not sign up for, and I paid, signed, and thanked the server for their professionalism, while Joy kept smiling as if good lighting could eat a freeze notice. My mother squeezed the letter in her hand the way some people squeeze napkins when they want to cry without making a scene, and she asked me under her breath if this was necessary, if there was not a kinder way. And I told her in a voice that belonged to both of us that kindness without boundaries is not kindness, it is permission, and that I would not let anyone, not even her favorite person in the room, empty her accounts with pretty invoices and rehearsed gratitude. Pastor Glenn asked if there was anything the church could do to help my mother feel secure while this got sorted out, which was his way of placing weight on the side of the scale that kept slipping, and Joy, feeling the tilt, leaned in as if the two of us were teenagers again sneaking secrets in the hallway after curfew, and she smiled with that Showtime brightness that had carried her through every family gathering, every fundraiser, every photo where she stood a little closer to the person who mattered most, and she said, enunciating each word as if they were pearls and not pebbles, "Take your little papers and try me," and I answered without raising my voice, "So I will." While Ethan stared at the cake like it might offer him an alibi, and my mother finally looked down at the letter long enough to realize that for once, the applause had stopped right on time. The day after the dinner, I woke before my alarm with the kind of headache that comes from holding your jaw tight while you pretend you are not angry. And instead of sitting there replaying the toast and the card decline and the way my mother gripped that letter as if it might crumble if she loosened her hand, I opened my laptop, laid out the statements, the invoices, the copies of reimbursement notices, and I called an elder law attorney whose name had come to me from a nurse who once told me she trusted this woman more than anyone when families got messy around money, and when Ms. Rhodes answered with that dry voice that wastes no one's time, I said that I needed to know what would protect my mother without turning our lives into a courtroom circus. And she said to bring everything, not my feelings, not my guesses, just the documents and the timeline and any signatures that looked off. I arrived with a binder I had put together after midnight, and as she read in silence, I watched the small changes in her expression that tell you when a professional has found the parts that matter, the round numbers repeated like drumbeats, the lack of service notes attached to any coordination claims, the fact that the reimbursement checks were deposited into an account tied to my sister's LLC rather than to any license provider, and finally the copy of a power of attorney packet my mother had signed at Joy's Kitchen Island under the banner of Making Things Easier, a packet whose notary page did not match the date in my mother's calendar and whose witness signature belonged to an employee at my brother-in-law's office. Ms. Rhodes did not scold me for not catching this earlier. She did not perform outrage. She did not feed me easy lines about villains and saints. She simply drew a short list on a yellow pad and said that the safest path was to remove discretion from the people who had treated discretion like a costume, and to replace it with a structure that leaves footprints, which in our world means formal notices. A clean accounting demand, an adult protective services report that places the facts in a state file without theatrics, and a simple living trust for my mother's home, and core accounts with an independent co-trustee from the bank so that every distribution leaves a trail my sister cannot polish, with a caption and a heart emoji. I nodded because this was the language I understood, not the language of family roles and unspoken debts, but the language of signatures, demands, and dates that do not move when someone makes a scene. We started with the accounting letter, and I watched Ms. Rhodes draft it with the kind of clinical precision that makes people who thrive on charm sweat behind their smiles. A page that named Joy's LLC, listed the months and the transaction amounts, cited the statutory duty to account when acting as agent or a de facto manager of a vulnerable adult's assets, and set a clear deadline for a response with backup documentation, after which the letter instructed that all withdrawals from the reimbursement sub-account must cease until proper verification was provided. She then filed the Adult Protective Services intake in language that did not accuse beyond the evidence, which matters because the first person to shout rarely wins, whereas the first person to submit organized proof often does. And finally, she explained the trust documents, how my mother could sign them without cutting herself off from her own decisions, how a bank co-trustee would add weight to every check and make sure no one rides on goodwill again, and how any pretense of "I did not know" would be answered by a ledger and a signature block. When I left her office, I went to the insurer. And, because I speak their paperwork dialect, I submitted a voluntary disclosure packet that flagged duplicate reimbursements and requested that all future checks require provider notes with dates of service and signatures from actual licensed staff, which is not a punishment but a lock on a door that should never have been left open. And then I called Mr. Alvarez to confirm the sub-account freeze was holding, which it was, and that he had added a note to the file indicating that all communications should route through me and Ms. Rhodes while the review was active, which he had, because when you bring people facts and not drama, they will often pick up the rope and pull with you. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother asking whether I could come over because she felt ganged up on, and the ache in that phrase scraped something old in me. The part that used to believe my role was to sand down every edge so the favorite would never have to feel friction. Yet I went anyway because she deserved to hear this from my mouth and not from Joy's version of me. And when I laid the statements on her table, she said that Joy had told her consultants help keep paperwork straight, and that she had signed whatever made life easier, and I answered that easiness is not free, that someone had been collecting round numbers without the notes to justify them, that the bank had already seen enough to set a freeze, and that an attorney had sent a letter asking for a real accounting rather than a caption about care. She cried, not because she wanted to hurt me, but because no mother wants to be told that the child she trusts ran lines through her money without asking, and she asked whether this would ruin Joy's life, and I said that what ruins lives is denial, that what saves them is sunlight and structure, and that I was choosing both for her even if it cost me another decade of being labeled difficult. When I left, I stopped by the church office where Pastor Glenn was cataloging donation receipts, and I placed in his hands a single page that showed the month where the reimbursements and Joy's invoices matched like mirror images. And I told him I was not asking him to take sides. I was asking him to know the truth if my mother reached for him because she was afraid, and he thanked me with the quiet relief of a person who prefers records over rumors, and he said he would pray for wisdom, which I took to mean he understood that passivity would now be a choice with consequences. Late that evening, while I was washing a mug that still smelled like the coffee I had needed to keep my voice steady, a knock sounded on my sister's cul-de-sac, and a neighbor texted me a picture, because that is how neighborhoods work now. A man in a jacket with a folder under his arm facing Joy's doorbell camera, and 2 minutes later my email pinged with a confirmation from Ms. Rhodes's office that service had been completed, and although I do not collect moments of triumph like trophies, I allowed myself one slow breath that felt like a door closing softly enough not to wake the house yet firmly enough to latch. 2 days later, a process server left a packet at Joy's front door with my name in the first paragraph and the words "failure to account" in the second. By the time the process server had finished his work and Joy's name was formally tied to words like "failure to account," the gloss that she wore so easily in public had already begun to lose its polish. Although she tried to deny it with the same practiced brightness that had carried her through every church event, every community fundraiser, and every family dinner where my mother applauded on cue. On the surface, she kept the performance going with carefully staged social media posts that showed her delivering flowers to Mom's door, captioned with little speeches about devotion and sacrifice. But anyone who looked closely enough would notice that the comments praising her selflessness were quieter now, and some of the senior center board members who had always rushed to like and share her updates suddenly turned neutral, as if they had been warned that their reputations might sink if they stood too close to a ship taking on water. I stayed silent online because I had learned long ago that the best way to expose a script is to leave it running until the lines collapse under their own weight. Behind the stage lights, consequences were quietly stacking up. The senior center board, where Joy had been angling for a leadership role, called a private meeting and suggested that until the questions about reimbursements were resolved, she should step back from visible donor events, which for someone like Joy is not just a professional bruise, but a direct wound to the image she values more than stability itself. Pastor Glenn, who had accepted donations with her name attached more than once, recused himself from decisions that involved her and told her plainly that she should clear her records in writing if she wanted the trust of the congregation again. When she repeated to my mother that these were all misunderstandings, my mother clung to that explanation the way someone clings to a familiar blanket, insisting that surely things could be explained away. I did not argue. I simply kept laying out the paperwork like bricks, one line of defense after another, until even she could see that explanations without proof are nothing but air. The phone calls came next, not from my sister but from her husband, because Ethan always preferred to be the reasonable one who smooths things over, even as he let his wife orchestrate whatever story served her best. He suggested that we could avoid embarrassment if I agreed to accept a partial repayment, that perhaps Joy had made mistakes, but her intentions were good, that dragging this through legal channels would do nothing but fracture the family. His words were calm, his tone almost professional, but beneath it all was the same arrogance that assumed I could be coaxed into trading the truth for a more comfortable lie. I told him that bargains without full accounting are not bargains, they are cover-ups, and that the only way forward was transparency, repayment, and removal of Joy from every decision that touched my mother's money or property. He went silent, then muttered that I was colder than he thought, which told me he finally understood that I had no interest in deals that left any door half open. The shift I had been waiting for came not from institutions or attorneys, but from my mother herself. One evening she knocked on my apartment door without Joy at her side, and when I invited her in she did not begin with defenses or accusations. She simply asked me to show her exactly what I had been talking about. For the first time, she wanted to see the numbers instead of the explanations. I spread the papers across my table and walked her slowly through 1 month where the reimbursements and Joy's invoices mirrored each other with impossible neatness. She leaned over the totals, her lips tightening as she whispered that she had never authorized consults, that she thought her insurance was paying doctors and therapists, not her own daughter's LLC. There was a long silence in which I let her see what she needed to see, and when she finally looked up at me her eyes carried both hurt and resignation, as though she had been forced to admit that the golden glow she had chosen to believe in had been lit by stolen fuel. At that exact moment my phone buzzed with a message from Ms. Rhodes confirming that she had filed for a temporary suspension of Joy's power of attorney on the basis of the notary irregularities, and that she had also prepared the living trust documents to secure the family home and accounts under a structure that required oversight. When I explained it to my mother, she asked if this meant I was taking control away from her, and I told her no, that it meant she was regaining control with safeguards that could not be faked or spun, that it was not about my power but about her protection. She sat quietly, holding the paper, as though weighing her loyalty against her survival, and though she did not speak the words, her silence told me she understood that denial was no longer an option she could afford. Joy, of course, reacted as expected once she received notice. She posted long, vague updates about family betrayal and jealousy, carefully crafted to invite sympathy from people who did not know the details, but sympathy has a short shelf life when evidence begins to circulate, and the people who matter in small communities, board members, pastors, bankers, even the local pharmacist, had already seen enough to step back. The more she tried to spin, the less it landed, because her reputation was no longer under her control. It was under the weight of stamped documents and official letters that spoke more loudly than any caption could. The day the court set the hearing date, I was sitting at my kitchen table with my mother, showing her once again how the trust would function, and my phone buzzed with the official notice. I read the time and place aloud, and she did not flinch. She did not ask Joy what to do. She did not reach for the phone to explain it away. For the first time in years, she sat with me in silence, accepting that the path had already been drawn, and though the road ahead would not be easy, at least she was finally walking beside me rather than behind Joy's shadow. The hearing date landed on my phone while Diane was sitting at my kitchen table, and for the first time in years, she did not call Joy first. The morning of the hearing arrived with the kind of heaviness that lingers even when you pretend to be calm, and although I had rehearsed every possibility in my mind, I knew that the courtroom would not reward clever speeches or dramatic gestures, but only the slow, unyielding weight of paper, signatures, and facts that could not be reshaped by charm. I dressed without fuss, carried the binder Ms. Rhodes had helped me prepare, and reminded myself that I was not fighting for pride or for revenge alone, but for the security of my mother's future and for the restoration of boundaries that had been eroded by years of favoritism and manipulation. My mother sat quietly in the car beside me, not offering excuses for Joy this time, but not offering encouragement either. Her silence a fragile admission that whatever was about to unfold, she could not shield anyone from it anymore. When Joy entered the courthouse lobby, she carried herself with the same Showtime energy she always used, a bright smile plastered across her face, as if she had arrived to host an event rather than to answer questions under oath. She wore confidence like a costume, leaning on Ethan's arm and greeting acquaintances as if the entire ordeal were a minor misunderstanding soon to be dismissed. But as soon as the clerk called the case and the judge asked for opening statements, the tone shifted because Ms. Rhodes did not waste words on character or conflict. Instead, she laid out the pattern of reimbursements, the mirrored invoices from Joy's LLC, the absence of provider notes, and the irregularities in the notarized power of attorney that had given Joy her false authority. It was not a story, it was a map of how money had moved, step by step, from an insurer meant to pay for care into the pockets of someone who had framed it as devotion. Joy tried to interrupt, insisting that every payment had been approved verbally by my mother, that coordination time counted as legitimate service, that her efforts had saved our family from chaos. But when Ms. Rhodes asked her to provide a single signed service note, a dated log, or any documentation from a licensed provider that justified those exact amounts, Joy had nothing except vague words and irritated sighs. Ethan attempted to rescue her with a polished explanation about consultants being common in elder care, but the judge pressed for evidence, not theories, and when Joy's binder offered nothing but self-generated invoices with recycled descriptions, the silence in the room cut through her practiced glow. The turning point came when the notary logs were introduced. Ms. Rhodes produced records showing that the stamp used on the house-related form came from a notary who had been out of state on the date listed. That meant the signature was invalid, the authorization void, and every action taken under that document stood on sand. The judge's eyebrows lifted only slightly, but the implication landed like a gavel long before he spoke. My mother's home, her accounts, her very independence had been placed in jeopardy under a document that was nothing more than a fabrication, and the realization spread through the courtroom like a chill. Instead of allowing the moment to spiral into accusation, Ms. Rhodes presented the prepared solution with the calm authority of someone who understands that courts prefer repairs to recriminations. She laid out the living trust already signed by my mother, properly notarized, properly witnessed, and reinforced by an independent co-trustee from the bank who would oversee every major transaction. It was clean, simple, and legally sound. The judge reviewed it, confirmed my mother's understanding, and then recognized the trust, suspending Joy's authority pending a full accounting. Joy's face froze in a smile that no longer had any audience, because the performance was over, replaced by the sharp clarity of orders stamped and filed. The weeks that followed brought mediation, not because Joy suddenly embraced accountability, but because the weight of official documents had left her with no stage on which to dance. She arrived with Ethan, still wearing the armor of indignation, and attempted once more to frame herself as misunderstood. Yet the terms were already written: repayment of the duplicate amounts over time, removal of her from all financial decisions regarding my mother, and a no-contact agreement in matters tied to money or property. Ethan tried to haggle, to soften, to frame it as overkill, but in the end they both signed, not with grace, but with the kind of bitterness that comes when denial has no air left to breathe. That night, I did not plan a celebration or stage a victory. Instead, I cooked a quiet dinner with my mother and handed her a binder labeled "Your Choices," filled with clear instructions, contacts, and the trust documents that guaranteed she would never again be left vulnerable to the manipulations of people who mistook her love for a blank check. She looked through it slowly, running her hand over the cover as if touching something solid after years of illusions, and although she did not thank me, I did not expect her to, because gratitude was never the point. The point was protection, even if it looked to her like betrayal in the moment. Later that night, long after my mother had gone to bed, my phone buzzed with a message from Joy. It contained only one sentence: "You could have kept this in the family." I stared at it for a long time, then looked at the binder sitting on the counter, the binder that represented safety, structure, and the refusal to let silence continue its slow destruction. I typed back a single reply, measured and final: "I did." I looked at the trust binder and replied, "I did."